Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you would like to jump right to a specific point in the video, you can mouse over or tap on the video playback area of your screen, which will reveal the chapter titles and links to those starting points. Or you can use the time-stamped links down in the video description. In this week's podcast, I have tidbits. I have a finished item. I want to talk about Finish It February and how to figure out what kind of knitter you are as you approach dealing with your unfinished objects. And then I want to talk about the Conservationist Consortium that I attended today via Zoom. So let's get started. This first tidbit showed up in my Twitter feed this past week, and it's from a woman who has a fantastic surname, which is Yarn. But what she was sharing was her paternal grandmother's sewing kit. And she remembered seeing both of her grandmothers with their sewing kits as she was growing up. But her grandmother had died, I think, about 20 years ago. And since her grandmother's death, her grandfather had used the sewing kit occasionally to sew on a button or make it some other kind of repair. But otherwise, the kit was exactly as it had been since her grandmother's death. So she went through the contents of it, and it was really fascinating because there were so many things in there that were clearly very vintage. And one of the interesting things was that her grandmother had kept all of the instruction sheets for various things that she used, including this little gadget that was a special type of needle threader that would have been kind of tricky to figure out, but she had the instruction sheet. So I'll leave that below because it's just a really interesting look at a lifetime's worth of sewing notions and items in somebody's beloved grandmother's sewing kit. So this next tidbit also comes from my Twitter feed, and I will put links to those Twitter posts down in the show notes down below. This was posted by a woman named Cassidy Percoco, who is a fashion and material culture scholar. She's the collections manager at two different museums in Cooperstown, New York, the Fenimore Art Museum and the Farmers Museum. Plus, she's the author of Regency Women's Dress 1800 to 1830. And what she was talking about was the myth of button position. There is a lot of discussion about, the reason why women's clothes button in one direction and men's button in the other. And the gist of it is those are all myths, and it was pretty random before the 1800s. Could be on either side for either sex, didn't matter. And it wasn't until a very particular time in the 1800s where you started to see this separation. It was a very specific gendered decision to place the buttons for women on one side and the men on the other. And it had nothing to do with trying to pull your sword out or having a maid try to dress you. None of that is true. But I found it really, really interesting. So again, I will leave the link to that Twitter thread down below because I found it fascinating. So this next tidbit came from one of you who posted this in my Ravelry group, and I thank you very much for this. So the it was a link to an article about a physicist at the Georgia Institute of Technology in Atlanta. Her name is Elisabetta Matsumoto, and in part, a little bit of the article says that she is teasing out the mathematical rules that dictate how stitches impart such unique properties to fabrics. She hopes to develop a catalog of stitch types, their combinations, and the resulting fabric properties. Knitters, scientists, and manufacturers could all benefit from a dictionary of knits, she says. So what she's talking about is that yarn does have some elasticity to it, but knitted fabric has an incredible range of elasticity. In some cases, it has no stretch at all, and in other cases, it's extremely stretchy. And that has to do with how the stitches are interconnected and what stitches are combined together. And that's what she's studying. So I'm going to leave a link to that article down below. This next tidbit also came up in my Ravelry group, and I will leave a link to that actual thread down below because it was a question posed by one of the people in the group who had been watching a documentary on poverty in Nottingham, England, that had the documentary had been made in the 1960s. And in that documentary, they were talking to a woman who was a home worker. So she was she had a bunch of like lace fabric on her lap, and she was pulling these threads out while she was talking to the interviewer. And this was something that she did like all day, every day, and she made about 3 pounds per week. I think her husband only made about 12 pounds per week. So they were very poor, and they needed her extra income as well. So they were talking about the conditions in which she was working on, but the person who posted the link to the documentary was trying to figure out what the woman was actually doing, like what was the craft that she was involved in. So it was mostly a discussion between two people in that thread who were finding links to other videos and articles and things like that until they finally figured out what was going on. So I'm going to leave a link to that discussion thread because it just so that you have the context to it. So what was going on is that there were these wide pieces of lace fabric, but really the lace was in strips, and they were just held together by threads in between, and those threads needed to be removed. Presumably the machines couldn't just make a narrow strip of lace. They had to do it in this wider thing, and apparently it was cheaper to hire humans to pull out all of these threads than it would be to have that done by machine. And so there were all kinds of women in this particular neighborhood that was very poverty stricken who would sit around, and that is what they were doing all day, was pulling these threads out from in between these strips of lace. And then once the strips were freed from the larger piece, they would be wound around pieces of cardboard and then sold in a shop as lace edging for slips and other undergarments that people would sew onto their clothing. The fact that something would be considered cheaper to do by hand than by machine, I thought was startling. But anyway, I will leave that down below. As you notice, when I am telling you about these tidbits, I'm always telling you that I'm leaving links to whatever the topic is down below in the show notes. Now that is often true, even if I don't mention specifically that there is a link to something. So anytime you have a question about something related to my video and you can check the show notes, because there's a very good chance that that whatever it is that you're interested in might be down there. In particular, one of the things I get asked about a lot is whatever sweater I happen to be wearing during Casual Friday. Sometimes I get asked if I knit what I'm wearing, and the answer is always yes. If I'm wearing a knitted item, I knit it myself. The next question I get is there a pattern for the sweater that you're wearing? Sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. Sometimes the pattern is not easily accessible because maybe it's an antique pattern or a vintage pattern. This particular sweater pattern is available online through Project Gutenberg. It's from World War I, and one of the issues I had with this sweater was that the instructions for the collar were basically missing from the pattern. It's not that there was a page missing, it's that there was a printer's error, and so I had to figure it out for myself. But regardless, whatever I'm wearing, I will always include a link down in the video description to my Ravelry project page for that item. And I've been talking about Ravelry project pages the past couple of weeks. And so on my project page for this sweater, for example, there will be a link to the actual pattern page. And the pattern page in the Ravelry database will have links. If it's something that is available online, there will be a link to that. If it's a pattern that's contemporary that somebody is selling on Ravelry, there will be a link to buy it. If it's a pattern that's from some book, whether the book is still in print or not, that information about the source of the pattern will be there. So, and in addition, I always include whatever yarn I use. There'll be information about the needles I use. There'll be all of my notes. If I included any kind of notes, you'll be able to see when I started it, when I finished it, all of that kind of thing. So if you're ever wondering about some knitted item that I'm wearing and whether or not there is a pattern, then you can find that down in the show notes. I do have a finished item this week. I don't have it to show you because I dropped it off, but I did take a photograph of it. This is the baby blanket that I had started last week and was telling you about. It's for a charity project in our community that was part of Martin Luther King Jr. Day of Service. The project is to make baby blankets for several organizations in town who serve youths, and these blankets in particular are for like teenage mothers with babies and to distribute those blankets to those mothers. I started it on Monday, finished it on Sunday, and it really was about as big a blanket as I would care to knit in terms of all in one shot. They get pretty boring after a while because it's just straight and it's repetitive. So about the time where I am just sick of it, I'm close to the end, and I was able to that was the motivation to power on through. So I wove in all the ends, I washed it so that it would soften up and be really nice, and I dropped it off at the house of the person who is coordinating the distribution of all that with the different organizations. But I did finish that this week, so I thought I'd share that. Finish It February starts Monday, February 1st, although there aren't really any rules when it comes to Finish It February, and if you feel like starting it now, you can do that. If you don't feel like doing it until June, that's fine as well. There's nothing that says that you have to do things any particular way. And so the past few weeks I've been trying to share with you different ideas for how you can approach Finish It February. So the idea behind Finish It February is to pull out all of your unfinished objects and then just go through each one and decide, do you actually want this? Do you like it? Would you enjoy knitting it? Or would you just want to say, no, I'm done with it. I'm never going to finish it. So you go through your things like that, and then you can make a plan for what it is you think you want to finish or how you want to go about finishing it. So, but one of the things that I don't ever really address too much is what you do with the things you've decided you aren't going to finish. What I tend to do is just return it to stash, and it's like it exists as it is, and if there's something I decide I want to do with it in the future, like if I decide I want to use that yarn in the future, at that point I would rip it out. But if I have decided that I am finished with this, I don't want to spend any more time on it, I don't typically spend time ripping it out and winding up the yarn again and returning it to stash. In part because the knitting is perfectly fine usually. I like the knitting, it's just that I don't want the object. So I don't see any reason to destroy it, but it just is what it is. Inevitably, I will get suggestions from people in the video comments about what I could do with those unfinished things. Some people are afraid that I am going to just, rip out all of the knitting, and that is not what I would do. But if that's something that you would want to do, like if you like, oh, I hate this, but I love the yarn, by all means, rip it out. But I've always been puzzled by why are people giving me suggestions about what to do with this? Why would I want to do something with this? Why would I want to turn this into something else? I was always puzzled by that. And so last week, I was talking about the Bernie Sanders mittens, and there was so much discussion about it, and I heard that they were made from recycled sweaters, and I found that intriguing, and the description of them made them sound really warm, which is something that would be really useful to me in Minnesota, whereas regular knitted mittens typically aren't warm enough for me. So I was really intrigued by how they were made, what was done with it. And so I was telling you guys about that, and I was thinking about how, that is something that I would want and need and I could use. And I have the materials for it. I have these unfinished sweaters that I could felt and cut up and turn into these mittens. And that's so nice. I have the materials for that. So I immediately got suggestions for other things I could do with those if I had leftovers, or I could make, again, pillows. People often want me to make pillows out of my unfinished things. So I was thinking about this more analytically, like, why is this that people are suggesting this all of the time? And what I realized was that I had seen a project that was interesting to me, that I decided I wanted to make. And then I realized, oh, I have the materials to make something like that on hand. That's really fortunate. That's how I approach all of my knitting projects. I never start with the yarn. I never start with the materials that are necessary to make the project. I always start with the project. And I do it in one of two ways. One is I think about, well, I really like to knit a sweater. What kind of sweater is it going to be? Is it going to be a cardigan or pullover? What do I want the neck to be like? Do I want cables? Like, usually it's going to be some kind of heavily textured sweater, because that's the kind of stitch pattern I really enjoy. Sometimes it's color work. Typically, if it's a color work project, it's because I've seen a pattern for something in color work that I really liked, so I start with a pattern. I go, oh, I want to make that. And then I start looking at, do I want to make it as it is, or are there modifications? And then what colors would I use? Do I want to use the same colors that I saw in this, or do I want to do something different? And that sort of thing. So I always start with the project. And by the time I get to the yarn, what I need is something pretty basic and simple. Because I'm doing typically heavily textured things, usually it ends up being a solid color, worsted weight, wool yarn. So there's nothing particularly special really about the yarns that I use. Now, I'm not a big stash person. I don't have a lot of stash. If you were a beginning knitter and you walked into my knitting office and you saw the amount of yarn I have, you might think I have a big stash. A lot of it is leftovers. And a lot of it is yarn that I bought for a project, then just fizzled. I didn't end up making it. And then some yarn is I purchased because I wanted to experiment with different constructions of yarn without a project in mind. It was really just to swatch with. The types of yarns that I do buy just to have on hand are usually solid color, worsted weight wools in something that I know that eventually I will want a sweater with that color. And the reason I would have bought that sweater's quantity worth of yarn at that time might be because it was on sale, it was being discontinued, I was on a trip and it was a brand or a type of yarn, maybe it was a wool breed I'd never seen before, and I thought, well, I can't get this back home, so I'll buy it here. And it was in a color that I knew at some point I would make a sweater with it. The other kind of yarn I stash is self-striping sock yarn. Those are the kinds of projects I knit the most of. Sweaters and socks with self-striping sock yarn, just plain old socks. I don't knit a lot of fancy stitch patterns in socks anymore. I did at one time, and then I decided fancy stitch patterns for the sweaters, plain vanilla knitting for the socks. So when I decide I want to knit a pair of socks, I can just shop from my self-striping sock yarn that I have on hand. But that is how I think as a knitter. That's just my process. And that is why when I look at a UFO that I'm not going to finish, I don't think, what could I do with this? Like, what could this turn into instead? That is just not how my creativity works. But if it's something that you think about, if you typically start with the yarn and you have an unfinished project that you don't want the end result of that project, you might be the kind of person who does think, what can I turn this into instead? So I did some searching and just to kind of see what was out there. And I did find a website that had 50 DIY projects for upcycling sweaters. Now, a lot of their ideas are assuming that you have some sort of fine gauge machine knit store-bought sweater. but many of them would work regardless of what kind of sweater you had. And it doesn't have to be an unfinished sweater. It could be anything that had enough fabric to make whatever that item was. So I'm going to leave that link down below, because if you're the kind of person who, if you've decided you're not finishing something, it's just upsetting to you that it's not, something isn't going to happen with it, those ideas might be useful to you. Now, in addition, some people had left some ideas in the comments last week about things that I could do with my unfinished sweaters. One of them, there was pillows, of course, and one of them said that the Fruity Knitting podcast had somebody on recently who was using old sweaters to make teddy bears. So if that's something that is of interest to you, that's another choice. I don't know which Fruity Knitting episode it was, but I'm sure you could find it on their channel. And then there was another person, and I don't know if it was in the comments or in my Ravelry group, but her name is Gertrude. And she talked about using, what did she call it? I'll put it on the screen here. Sitte Underlag, which basically is like something to sit on. When I was a Girl Scout, we had a project in Girl Scouts that was called, we made a sit-upon, it was called. And I don't remember what we made ours out of, but it was something that we made. It was one of our craft things. And so it was some kind of a cover, and then you had a little pad inside. So when you went camping and you were sitting around the campfire, you'd have something dry and a little bit padded to sit on. When my daughter was in Girl Scouts, they made sit-upons as well. So that could be something like if you go camping, if you go to outdoor sporting events or something like that, you could felt an old sweater and make some kind of a little cushion that you could sit upon when you could take it with you or keep it in your car trunk or something like that. So once again, there's no rules to finish it February. You could, I have a project that I'm fixing. I had some sweater cuffs that were fraying that I fixed, and I'm knitting a belt and some belt loops for that sweater, and it's mostly done, but I'll be finishing it up sometime in the next few days. So I am fixing some things. And then you have the idea of like, what could you turn this into instead? If you have some really negative feelings about a project and it would just feel better about frogging it, where you rip it, and then turn it back into just balls of yarn, that's perfectly acceptable too. But we do have a discussion thread in my Ravelry group that I will link to down below, and you can post about photos of what it is you're hoping to finish, and then when you do finish them, you can post photos of that too. And also you can use a tag if you create Ravelry project pages for the things that you want to finish. You can use tags. You can use a tag for those items, and instructions about that are in the Finish It February thread on my Ravelry group, which you can. Last week, I was telling you in the Tidbits section about an event that was going on in the UK through the University of Glasgow, and it was called the Conservationists Consortium. Because of COVID, these kinds of conferences that are usually attended by a small number of academic types in a specific location, because they can't meet in person in the past year, they've been doing these kinds of events through Zoom. And instead of having 20 people in a room at the university, they had 382, I think was the highest number I saw, that were attending this morning. It was at 7:30 a.m. my time, but it was 1:30 p.m. in the UK. So it was really fun. And a couple of you who had found out about it through me sent me private messages through the chat in the Zoom and said hello to me. So I thought it was so fascinating. What I love about this kind of thing is learning, first of all, just learning that there are people in academia who are studying things like knitting. And then finding out what museums have items and what kinds of items they have and where they're located, and finding out more about their collections and what information is available to see online versus having to go in person. So I didn't really know what to expect from this. I didn't know what exactly they were going to be talking about. So I thought I would just go through this briefly. They did record it, but they're saying they are not going to like publish the recording of it anywhere. So it's not like, oh, I missed it, can I watch it? It doesn't sound like they're going to do that, but they are going to be writing up a blog post. So this is done through an organization at the University of Glasgow called Fleece to Fashion. And so I'll put a link down to their blog post, down to their blog below. And that is where a number of the fashion historians and people who study material culture that I follow on Twitter, I find out about each of them from people that they are retweeting or commenting on. So I found a number of these people in this particular way. They had people speaking from different museums, and they were talking about their collections and what it is they focus on, and then they had one person who was actually talking about how they do conservation, which was interesting. So they had people from the Shetland Museum and Archives. So that's a museum in Lerwick, I think. They are focused on collecting, the knitted items that they collect are things knitted by Shetlanders for export outside of Shetland, or knit by Shetlanders for other Shetlanders. So they may have been something that they knit for themselves or their family, hand knitted, or it could have been something that was manufactured in one of the knitting factories and someone purchased it in a shop. But it's an example of what was being manufactured or knit in Shetland over time. So they have 3 areas that they collect. They have the stranded color work items, they have lace items, and then they have items that they call plain knitting. So it wasn't anything particularly fancy, but these were things that ordinary people wore. So this is one of the focuses of this consortium, was talking about the collections and how museums are turning more toward collecting things that ordinary people wore rather than only focusing on the really high fashion stuff that the royalty wore, or that were, done by high-end designers or things like that. But what are the things that regular people wore? And what do we know? What does that tell us about the social history of those people? Hand knitting oftentimes hasn't been part of those kinds of collections, but they certainly are in the Shetland Museum. So their archives are things that are print, like documents or photographs and things like that. So sometimes they will have like a photograph of somebody wearing the sweater that they have in their collection now, which was really cool. They have examples that show sort of the design process that these knitters would have been going through. So they had a hand knit sweater that was pretty elaborate, and wasn't something that you would have necessarily seen outside of Shetland, but you could see that the designer had incorporated a lot of really intricate details into it. It had set-in sleeves, and it had like a lined neck that was a high collar neck that was aligned on the inside with other knitting, and so was the bottom hem, and then it had a zipper as well. And then they had a photograph of somebody wearing a sweater that was very much like that, but the stranded colorwork design was different. But you could see, like in the school picture, all of these kids wearing different types of knitting, and they weren't all wearing the same kind of knitted items. That was really interesting. They have pieces of fabric that she called them maquettes. Basically, those are like a trial run of something. So they have this piece of lace work that was a trial run for a lace shawl that was knit for Queen Victoria's 80th birthday. So they were working out the design in this original piece, and things weren't quite lining up, and there was, and so you could see that, like, oh, that didn't work, I guess we're going to have to do this, and they could kind of fix it and figure it out. And other things with the design was, like with the stranded color work, people would keep they would cut out bits of old knitting or, sweaters or things, and they would keep those basically as a reference, either because of the colorway, how they used color in it, or for the stitch pattern itself. So they didn't have maybe a stitch dictionary, but they had a collection of scraps that would inform them of particular design elements that they really liked. So all of that was super interesting to me. So I will leave a link to their museum and archives below. I'm not completely sure what they have available to view online for any of these. I briefly went and looked after the Zoom call to try to see if I could figure out what you could see online, and I think some of the stuff is going to be more limited, but you can at least find out something about them, I hope. There were two people talking from the National Museums of Scotland. So these were like separate museums in different locations, and they all have joined together as the National Museums. So that Shetland Museum was not a national museum, but its collection is considered important enough to have sort of national significance, and which makes them eligible for things like grants and things like that. But the National Museums of Scotland, there were two people who were talking for different talks, and one of them was talking about two of the buildings, or two of the museums that kind of merged I think in the late 90s. One of them had originally been this Museum of Antiquities, and the other was like a science and technology museum. And so each of those museums has some knitting in them. So not all of the knitting is confined to or curated by one location. So in the Antiquities, they have like this outfit that was uncovered. It was a 17th century, I guess, person, but the clothing had not deteriorated. So it's an entire outfit of an ordinary person that included things like stockings and a hat and things like that that were knitted. So that's the kind of thing you might find in the Antiquities, things that were from archaeological finds. So in that Science and Technology Museum, they also have like a world cultures, and then they also have a costume and dress collection. So one of the things they have are these really old Coptic socks that were some of the I think these are the same socks that people used to think was the earliest knitting, and it's not knitting, it's what we today would call nail binding. They have a pair of booties that were made using a technique that was called shepherd's knitting, which is essentially slip stitch crochet, and these are the oldest like booties in Scotland. So they're very cute little booties. Then we had somebody who was talking about conservation. So when you get an item that is not intact completely, there's parts that are coming apart, and what do you do to fix it, if anything? Like, how do you conserve it without restoring it? Because you want to make sure that it's clear what in there is original versus what was done in order to make you be able to see how the original item would have been used or what it would have looked like. So she showed a variety of techniques that they use for different types of items, including like if there was an old thing that had a lot of holes in the fabric, that they can use, slide in something that supports it, that has fabric on it that they digitally print to look like knitting. So they can put in this piece of supporting material into something like a mitten or something. And you can see in all of the holes, you see what looks like printed knitting on this woven textile, just to give your eye that sort of continuity, but it's always very clear what is the real thing and what isn't real. She walked through a couple of different scenarios for what they're trying to do, but they're not trying to restore it. Decisions are sometimes made to actually repair things, but still make it visible what was repaired, like there may be a slightly different color in the yarn that was repairing it. So for example, they showed this knitted corset from the mid-20th century. It was like a machine knitted thing, and it had some moth holes in it. And they decided those holes didn't happen because of wear and tear on it. It happened because they were stored in a closet somewhere and moths got to it. So they made repairs to the moth holes, but still it was with a yarn that was very close in color to the original, but still you could see where it was so that you would know where that repair was made. So that was really interesting as well. Another curator from the National Museums of Scotland is working on post-war hand knitting, and she is particularly interested and was telling us about a man named Bernat Klein, who was a very influential textile designer in the mid-century. He worked with a lot of high-end couture fashion people. He had his own business as well, and he started getting interested in creating textiles himself, and to do that, he was really experimenting with color, and he innovated the space dyeing, which is to take, length of yarn and you are dyeing it different colors at different intervals, and which is basically what happens with things like self-striping yarn that we use nowadays. And his wife was a knitter, and so he decided to create these yarns for knitters, and she designed a lot of the patterns and then worked with the knitters. They would have this, you could go to a store and have them, a professional knitter make a pattern for you. You could buy the yarn and pattern and have someone make it for you. And so she worked with those knitters. And they had these kits where they would have these really cool yarns. And these were considered really high-end yarns. Cool yarns and then matching fabrics. And you buy it in a kit so you could make yourself a skirt and a matching sweater. And I had never heard of him. And I assumed, several people in the comments or in the chat assumed or wondered if Bernat yarn that we have here in the US, if that was somehow related to his company, and it doesn't appear that there is any relation. And the last talk was from the Scottish Fisheries Museum. So they have a variety of things that they collect that are related to the fishing industry there. And one of those things has got to do with knitted ganseys and things like that fishermen wore. They had a photograph, though, of all of these women who were there gutting herring, and they were all wearing sweaters that were very much like fishermen ganseys. And I was surprised at that. I'd never seen anywhere anybody ever mention that women wore these sweaters as well. And I would be really interested in finding out more. One of the things that they are doing is because they have all of these items in their collection, and they're trying to find ways of making them accessible to people without damaging things, and if things are in stacks and boxes and risking the damaging them by trying to find these items underneath other items. They've got a good storage method for that they have done, but they're also taking photographs, like they're doing these 3D photographs of these items so that you could look at them from all angles and then look at them up close. Now, I went and took a look on their website after the talk, and I couldn't find if that was accessible now, if this is a project they're working on, and at some point we'll be able to have access to it. I couldn't find it on the website yet. But again, all of the museums I'm talking about, I'll leave links down in the video description. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.